Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I thought I would chat with you guys a little bit about speed work and the controversy around it, because in many strength circles and athletic circles and everything else, dynamic effort training is universally accepted to make you stronger. Whereas then you have the alternative that says strength is not measured in time. Strength is purely measured in how much weight you can lift and how fast you can do it is largely a genetic component and it doesn't matter. And a lot of the people who take that route will say, so it doesn't really help you in something like powerlifting, which is a measurement of pure strength, not a measurement of explosiveness or of power. And that is what they will argue. But many of those same people will agree that it can help someone reach their own explosive potential, but that's going to carry over better to sports and athleticism more than it will to pure strength, such as, again, how much will improve your squat, bench, deadlift, overhead press, 1 rep max, things like that. So the point they will generally make is that these are not necessarily time-dependent movements. Number two, they will point out that generally speaking, strength on big movements is a product of how much muscle you have and how efficiently you can recruit muscle fibers and how good your levers are, moment arms are, and your general technique that keeps you tight and keeps the bar in place. In other words, technique on these big lifts is mainly about maintaining a proper bar path where you get the best leverages. So people need to understand that. That is what technique means. Technique means using the bar path that's going to allow you to make the most efficient use of your levers. Therefore, you have to produce the lowest amount of force and lift the highest amount of weight. That is what technique means. And in some cases, even a reducing range of motion through that. But largely, muscle fiber and your ability to actually train heavy, like you've actually practiced doing heavy lifts so that you're good at 1 rep maxes. And your muscle mass is about all that you can do to increase your maxes. And there are many proponents of other methods will point that out who don't believe in speed work. Because we know based on the research that muscle mass is actually the biggest determining factor in any one given individual, because we cannot change our structure, our skeletons, our insertion points, any of that stuff. Those are not changeable. That something like 85 to 90% of your strength, and strength measured in 1 rep maxes on various lifts, comes from the amount of muscle hypertrophy that you have, right? There's good data on that. Like, that's not an arbitrary statement. There's pretty good research looking into that at this point, and modern stuff in the last few years. It actually does make that seem to be true. So they'll point out that, again, the speed work doesn't necessarily help you with that because it doesn't necessarily improve technique, and the speed doesn't matter because it's really just about, have you practiced doing big lifts so you're capable of straining, and explosiveness doesn't help you strain, just helps you follow through when you don't strain. Hopefully, in theory, keeps you from straining, and they are right about that. They are right about that, which is why people combine max effort work with it, because it teaches you how to strain and push through and how to use the muscle mass that you have. And you just have to get thick. You have to get big if you want to be strong. Now, the people who will say, well, what about this one guy? You're using the odd man out who probably still has massive muscles on a really small frame for the lift being done. Like the guys with the massive bench who have a small frame, they're small, light frame. They don't move the bar as far, and they usually still have enormous pectorals. They usually have big, thick slabs of pecs. That's why, right? They just don't have everything else big, and they've learned to just use their pecs to move the weight, and they've got enough pec to pull it off. So here's the point I'm going to make. Yet every person who does the speed work notices that it works. They all notice that it works. And the speed work being the examples of what I'm doing here. Dynamic work. High set, low rep training with relatively light weights, using things like bands, chains, stuff like that, to change the acceleration curves to where we explode maximally. Okay, in this case, I'm using 40% of my maxes on these lifts. 40% of my maxes in this particular set of clips, with 25 to 30% of my max in terms of band tension added. We're still talking about no more than 70% of my max weight on all these lifts at the lockout, even with the bands, right? Because you guys know my max box squat these days off that box is 512 pounds. So I've got 202 on there with 130 pounds of band tension. So that's what we mean by speed work, and then exploding with it as hard as possible. So what's the one thing that other people notice? And I've had this exemplified by natural bodybuilders I've met over the years who've run this style of training, and one of the things they all noted, if they had stalled in their gains, that they saw that they gained more hypertrophy. Like I noted every single one of the natural bodybuilders I talked to, and I've sat down and talked to some in detail, who had said things like, well, when I messed around with the whole West Side system for a while, I really noticed on the speed work, particularly when I started adding that in, the things like my traps, my back, my triceps, my hamstrings, and quads, all these muscles started growing again. And these are guys who were like, I hadn't gained any real muscle in about a year because, again, I was natural and everything. But they started noticing them thickening up. Well, why do you think that is? How do we really build muscle? We build muscle through workload density, muscle damage to some extent. These are all factors, right? Mechanical tension, metabolic fatigue, micro tearing, high workload training. Well, what is speed work? It's high workload training. So here's what I would suggest. I would suggest to people who think that it doesn't work, well, even if it doesn't work because of the theory that says it doesn't work, because it's a valid hypothesis. It's an interesting hypothesis. I'm going to disagree with it, but what I'm going to say is I'm going to assume they're right. There's an alternative explanation if they are right as to why guys still get stronger when they do it. It's because it makes you bigger. Speed work all uses compensatory acceleration. What do we know based upon compensatory acceleration studies? It exceeds the mind-muscle connection and muscle fiber recruitment when used on multi-joint exercises. It exceeds it. Therefore, compensatory acceleration when using multi-joint exercises is hypothetically a superior hypertrophy method. Single joint small exercises might not matter so much, but what are we doing speed work on? Squatting, pulling, pressing. These are all big movements. In fact, those three things I just listed are going to work pretty much every muscle in your body to a greater or lesser extent when combined together. Right? Well, what components do we have there? Compensatory acceleration, which means we hit upper threshold fibers on every rep. So if you do only 3 reps, you're actually getting on every set. Or singles or whatever. But people say, well, that's not many, but how many sets are you doing? So if you do 10 triples or 20 singles or 12 doubles on an exercise using compensatory acceleration, particularly when you're hitting against bands and chains and stuff like that, that also hit those muscles with a different strength curve than you might be used to under traditional training, what tends to happen? You start bringing up lagging areas in those muscles because we're hitting different strength curves. We're also hitting the sort of workloads that we would expect to see from very high set training, because we're getting upper threshold fibers on every rep. Well, we're talking anywhere from 20 to 30 reps in a session, quality reps with upper threshold muscle fibers being hit. And we tend to do these in very, very short workload densities, like very short rest times, right? Like those squats are done 90 seconds apart. These deadlifts are done 30 seconds apart. So 20 singles like that with compensatory acceleration done 30 seconds apart. It's a lot of work density. A lot of work density. Then things like bands start adding stuff like overspeed eccentrics. Well, what do we know about overspeed eccentrics? What do? They create more eccentric loading. Well, eccentric loading in a lot of studies has been linked to good hypertrophic response, right? So the people who are doing speed work correctly are hypertrophying with it. They're hypertrophying with it. But they're hitting hypertrophy through a third training modality. So what does that mean for things like concurrent periodization? It means you could work it in without performance breaking down. So you can treat it as a separate primary training to go with the max effort work, and you could still do metabolic work and metabolic conditioning behind both of them, right? Because it's a secondary training stress, what happens? It doesn't impact the primary ones in terms of breaking down their recovery and performance. So it gives you a third training modality between just going heavy and going light with a bunch of reps to induce hypertrophy and fatigue. And also because when we do dynamic work, what are we doing? We're rotating things like bands and chains in 3-week waves. Well, we know that stalls and plateaus tend to happen in around 3 weeks on anything we do. It's really common with the law of accommodation in training. Well, bands and chains have a different strength curve. There's going to be different weak muscle fibers that are going to get worked repeatedly, slightly differently. So we're basically changing to a slightly new variation with a little bit muscle fiber distribution throughout each of the big muscles every 3 weeks. So it's like it's like training a different exercise with a lot of volume and changing it 3 weeks to a slight variation of it. Well, don't we know that works for hypertrophy pretty well also? You ramp up and you ramp it in a pendulum wave, and then you change to a different exercise at 3 weeks and ramp it in a pendulum wave with progressive overload. Well, that is a fantastic hypertrophy protocol, and it's also easy to recover from. Right? Speed work is easier to recover from than doing a bunch of sets to failure on these same lifts. It's easier. What's the other thing it does? It helps you practice setups. If you do 10 sets of 3 on a speed bench, you have to set up on the bench and arch and set your back and unrack it 10 times in one session. It's a lot of practice. You have to set up under a barbell and get tight under a barbell on a squat 10, 12 times in one session, depending on how many sets you're doing. You're doing 20 speed pulls, what do you have to do? You have to get over and set up and practice setting your feet, gripping the bar, getting tight 20 separate times on 20 sets in one workout. So if we come back over to technique, what's it doing? We're learning technique, even though these are variations. We're learning how to set up and get in position, at least for these lifts, how to set the bar on our back, how to unrack the bench and get tight, how to arch, how to re-pull and get tight again and ratchet up tight, like on a 1 rep max on a deadlift. It's skill practice. So you have practice doing tons and tons of first reps and setups, tons of them, with a very large, easy to recover from hypertrophic stimulus. So even if people are right and they say that explosiveness doesn't carry over to maximum strength, it still gets you big. And getting big carries over to 1 rep max strength. And it helps you practice setting up and doing first reps, which also helps your 1 rep maxes. So even if these people are right, they're only right on a technicality. They're still wrong in the downstream effect of it. It's still going to make you stronger. All right, guys, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.